And we're also recording it to put on our Facebook page as well. So a little bit first about Transition Bay, just a minute or two. We're part of an international network of transition communities around the world. It started in England, small village of Totnes back in 2005, went viral. There's some 90 transition communities in Canada alone. We work at the local community level to build resilience in a fragile world. And I probably don't need much more to say about that in terms of how fragile the world is these days. But this is an example. Apple tree grafting is how do we build skills? How do we build resiliency? How do we build preparedness at the community level for things around the economy, the environment, energy, and so on? That's what we do. We're always looking for volunteers. We're always looking for donations. Feel free to go to our website, click on the donation button. If you want to help out, make sure you plug in. If you haven't already, get on our mailing list. We send out newsletters for events like this. There's going to be some great ones coming up rest of this spring, and we're already planning for stuff next fall, and you can stay plugged in with all of that. But without much further ado, I do want to introduce David Maxwell. David lives in Middle LaHave. He has been an apple advocate for 50 years, fascinated by apple trees, mostly motivated to save a lot of the old varieties that were no longer in commerce. And you're going to find out how many of those. It's some incredible statistics around old varieties of apple trees. And as part of that, of course, he learned just about everything there is to know about apple grafting, apple cultivation, and so on. He is a full-on expert. We're very fortunate to have David with us this evening, coming to us live virtually from Middle LaHave. He keeps now, his current incarnation of apple work is some 50 varieties on semi-dwarf rootstock on 1/6 of an acre in Middle LaHave. So we were talking with him, a lot of different kinds of apples for making cider, for cooking, and so on. So I think without needing to say much more, David, I want to turn it over to you. And I understand that you'll pause occasionally during your talk for questions. And then, of course, we'll have some discussion, Q&A at the end. But if anybody has questions along the way, feel free to type them into the chat box, and we'll be sure to get to everyone's questions one way or the other. So David, please go right ahead.
Okay. The first thing is to give you a little bit of background on where this is coming from. I have run grafting workshops every spring for a number of years, with the exception of the past 2 years because of COVID. I still am not comfortable running close contact things. So this is the next best thing, but it has increased, it's morphed, it's changed somewhat from a strict grafting workshop. So this now is broader than it was. I will share my screen so that you can see where we're going. And theoretically, you should now be able to see things, correct?
Looks good, David.
Good, okay. So, as noted here, there are anywhere from 10 to 20,000 named varieties of apples around the world. There you go. Oh, clicking the wrong arrow. Okay, here is a sort of agenda. I'm not totally adept at Zooming, so you'll have to sort of put up with my inability to do things correctly. We're going to talk about apples and varieties of apples, an abrupt but necessary deviation into the subject of rootstocks, which are also varieties, where to get trees. If you want an apple tree of something particular, where are you going to get it? And then we'll pause for people to ask their questions. If you have questions, put them into the chat box at the bottom over time, and Bob is going to collate them and feed them back to me when we get to this pause. Once we're satisfied with that, we go on to how you make your own trees, grafting and budding, and pause again and talk about that. And finally on to planting, care, and diseases. Yikes. How come my thing won't advance? My friends, we got a problem.
How about the arrow keys on your keyboard?
Yep, that's what on my keyboard, I can try that.
There we go.
Nope. It won't go beyond the first 2 slides. I'm going to stop the share.
Okay.
And no, that didn't work. What I need is to get into the technology. Here we go.
Sounds good.
Okay, now we got it going. Okay. So there are 10,000, anywhere from 10 to 20,000 named varieties, but there's less than 100 still commercially available. There were no apples in North America until the 1600s. There were no apples in Europe until around the 1200s or so. The apples are native to Kazakhstan, and they were spread via the Silk Road from Kazakhstan to Europe and finally to North America. Here is a native apple forest in Kazakhstan. These trees are all apple trees. There's nothing else grows there. And those are still present. They are restricted. You're not allowed to go there unless you are accompanied and certified and allowed to. They protect them very carefully. Here is the critical element here. The apples don't come true to seed. If you plant a seed of a Macintosh apple, you do not get a Macintosh tree. You get something that may or may not even resemble a Macintosh. And the reason for this is that apples have an enormous number of genes, 50,000 genes. We've only got 30,000. So when you assort all these genes, it's almost guaranteed that you will get something different with every time you make a cross. So what's my connection with all this and what's my pitch? Trust me, I'm a doctor, as well as a backyard fruit grower for 45 or 50 years. I'm 80 years old, and theoretically, I am doing this because I want to ensure that all these rare apples persist beyond my time before I turn to the soil. But to be honest, I'm just an apple pack rat. I collect apple trees of all different kinds. So what do you want to grow?
David, what was that last word in your last slide? You're a something or another?
A selectophiliac.
And is that an apple pack rat?
Well, it's a lover of apple collection.
Wow. Okay.
Yes. Milo is the Greek for an apple, and selectic is collection, and a philiac obviously is somebody who loves it.
Okay, thank you.
So we're going in the wrong direction again. So what do I want you to grow? It's entirely up to you, but you choose your apple variety dependent on the season that you want to pick them, the usage that you want to make of them. Do you want to keep them over the winter? Are they resistant to diseases? Are they resistant to handling? Personally, I choose apples based on taste, but that is no longer what most commercial growers are concerned about. Or just for fun. For example, my wife's name is Linda. I found a Linda apple, and so I got it. And it's actually a heck of a good apple. I'm collecting apple varieties that Isaac de Razy could have brought with him in 1632 when he founded the first capital of New France at the mouth of the LaHave River. And I'm making an orchard of varieties that he could have brought with him. And other things are, if you want different size trees, early bearing or late bearing, anchorage of your tree, all of those depend on the rootstock that you put all these things on. So where are you going to find this information? And incidentally, all these screens of resources are also saved as a resource on the Transition Bay website. And I'll give you the...
Well, and I'm gonna put the link in the chat box.
Okay.
It's right there for everybody to see. Great resources that David's provided to us.
So this is one of a number of screens that are saved in the resource list there. Lists of varieties of apples. Orange Pippin is an excellent source. They started in Britain, and it comes from the Cox's Orange Pippin is the original orange. And they've got about 4,000 varieties of apples listed with photographs and descriptions and information about them. Pomiferous, which I think is actually based in Australia, they've done them at least double in quantity with the same kind of content. So if you want to know something about a particular variety of apple, you can go to one or other of those sources, and that actually becomes relevant a little later in the presentation here. Beach published a 2-volume document or book, The Apples of New York, on all the apples that were in commercial production in New York around the 1900s. So it is a resource of history in the past. And if you can't find information somewhere else, then go ask me. And there's an email address that you can contact me at. Now, as I said, rootstocks get inserted here in a sudden jump. The reason why is because you need to understand what the effect of the rootstock is and why you choose a different rootstock. Because if you're going to buy an apple tree, you need to know what the rootstock is in order to know what kind of a tree you're going to get. And when you start grafting, if you do decide you're going to graft yourself, then you also need to know all about rootstocks. So the main criterion is the size of the tree that you're going to get eventually. The smaller the tree, the more precocious it is, the earlier it will bear, but the shallower the roots and the more support it will need to grow. The smaller trees, the dwarf trees, need support throughout their entire lives. The semi-dwarfs can often do with support for the first 4 or 5 years, and then after that, it doesn't matter if the stake rots off or whatever, they will support themselves. So those are the main criteria that you need to apply. And then some rootstocks are better in some different soils. Some have disease and insect resistance, cold tolerance, anchorage, and some of them will also even alter the shape of the tree above them. Here's a list of rootstocks by size, starting on the bottom here. The M stands for Malling, and MM is Malling Merton, because they got a virus in there, or a fungus or a virus, I'm not sure, in their orchard in Malling. So they moved down the road to Malling Merton and cleaned up their rootstocks, got rid of all the latent viruses, which is a major problem in apple trees, at least in the view of the authorities. So starting down at M27, these things grow about 3 feet high. They got a 6 feet high, but the M27 is really small. There is no relationship between the numbering on the Malling series and the size. So an M27 is very small. M26 is a semi-dwarf. And just next to it, just in passing, you can also grow small trees by using a good, vigorous rootstock, plugging a piece of M26 or M9 into the vigorous rootstock, a short length, about 8 inches, and then your variety above. And that's called an interstem tree. And it gives you the advantages of a good, solid, hardy rootstock with the dwarfing effect of what you've grafted onto it. You can't get those commercially. If you want that, you do it yourself. And actually, a number of my trees are on interstem rootstocks. So M26 is a common one, and that's what I have, what I've been using recently. And the next bump that people generally go with is the MM111, and the MM is Malling Merton. And then the seedling tree will grow to 20 feet high. So that gives you an idea of the relative sizes. Don't worry if you don't remember all these numbers and names, because it comes back up again. And here's a list of various rootstocks, selected rootstocks. M9 is a good branch spread. They extract soil calcium well, so they don't get bitter pit. Ottawa 3, which is what I have some of my apple trees on, is very hardy. It comes out of Ottawa. It was bred by the Ottawa Research Station, but it hates to be moved. If you move the tree grafted onto Ottawa 3, it will sulk for 2 years before it starts to grow. It's just hopeless. So I don't recommend people doing that. Supporter 4 is currently becoming quite popular. It was an East German rootstock that became known to the West with the fall of the Berlin War. And then the rest of it is explanatory. So if I want to get a grafted tree, where can I get it? Well, Transition Bay is working on a deal with Baldwin's Nursery. Baldwin has only half a dozen or so varieties, but you can find details by going to Baldwin Nursery website and scroll down. They grow a whole bunch of other things besides apples. They're not sort of really specialized in apples, but you can see what they actually have available. And if you talk nicely to the people at Transition Bay, they were organizing a group purchase. Maple Grove Nursery is a recently established nursery up in the valley. So they're Nova Scotian. They're available. They're local. They're easily available. They are growing a number of varieties that are rather unusual. And I think partly because They actually come from Australia. They're an Australian company, a couple. And so they brought with them their knowledge of some of the varieties that are grown in Australia but are less known here. So they've got some very interesting varieties. And again, if you go to their website, you can scroll through there and you can find out what they're growing. And I think I will emphasize at this point that there are different things that you get from different places. If you go to Baldwin's, you get large multi-year trees, and I haven't been able to determine exactly how old they are, but they're big trees that are almost bearing or are bearing. If you go to Maple Grove or to me, you will get 1-year-old trees. So they were grafted last year. Maple Grove grows their trees in a patented process involving sort of soluble packages called Elapots that groom themselves or prune themselves by air pruning. This is all a sort of high-tech thing, but at the end of it, they will produce an apple 1-year-old that will not have any root shock when you transplant it, because it's in this nice, neat little package. So that's their thing. They also are selling their trees at quite a lot less than you will find in most places. Most trees sell for about $60 a piece. The Maple Grove nursery 1-year whips are $25. Next one, and so those are available locally and now. If you go beyond Nova Scotia, you get into difficulties of shipping, and shipping becomes enormously expensive for nursery stock. The interesting place, and I have no idea what Whiffletree will do in terms of shipping, but Whiffletree is a farm in Ontario run by an old order Mennonite. And so they are very attuned to old things, and they have an enormous range of apple varieties. The interesting thing, parenthetically, in this is that as an old order Mennonite, the fellow who is running this computer-based sales effect isn't allowed to use a computer. So he's got a workaround that he's running this website without actually using a computer himself, which I think is absolutely fascinating. And it works. He's highly successful. Cornhill is up in New Brunswick. So if you're near, I've forgotten the name of the community, but it's just across the border from Nova Scotia. He has a number of old apple varieties. He doesn't like to ship because it's so expensive and so hazardous. And finally, you've got me, and because I had purchased rootstocks for a grafting workshop last year, which didn't happen, I ended up with a whole bunch of rootstocks. I grafted those rootstocks myself with a whole list of things, which is posted on the Transition Bay website. So there's a list at that link of the things that I have, and I will happily sell those grafted trees to anyone that wants them for $20 a pop, which is cheaper than anybody else. So you'll have to look at what they are. And I mention specifically amongst those things. I haven't listed all the things that I've got here, but I mentioned amongst those because you won't find them elsewhere. New York 18491 was a variety that was developed by the New York Research Station. It was put out for trial by the commercial growers. The commercial growers didn't like it. It never went any farther. It never got a name, but I acquired it, and it is an excellent apple. It's a very, very good apple in our climate. And that may be part of it. It may be that it works well in our terroir, but not elsewhere. Linda is the one that I got because my wife's name was Linda, and it is equally a very good apple, matures in late September. Tango wine is a variety that you won't find anywhere else. It arose in New Brunswick about 50 years ago. So, and it is entirely local. You won't find it anywhere else. Again, I have both grafting wood and a tree of Tango wine. Glowing Heart is a gorgeous red fleshed apple that makes a spectacular red apple jelly. It's sort of crimson color throughout. And it is something that was developed by Fred Jansen, who was one of my mentors in Ontario, that got me interested in apples in the first place. And finally, Bellevaux. Bellevaux apple is one of these apples that is disappearing. It is critically endangered. I found one tree of the Bellevaux apple, which was an Acadian apple, up on the Acadian shore. I managed to get some grafting wood of it. I have grafted it in my orchard, and I have grafting wood available of Bellevaux if I can find somebody, preferably or quite possibly named Bellevaux, who would like a Bellevaux tree. Come and get it. Any questions so far? Bob, has anybody asked any questions?
Well, we do have one from Kathy, and she wants to know if the grafting techniques you're going to be teaching, how applicable are they to peaches and plums?
Basically, they are essentially identical. Any of the fruit trees can be grafted following exactly the same processes. And my reaction would be, are you sure you want to grow, for example, plums? Growing plums in Nova Scotia is exceedingly difficult because everything is infested with black knot, and the plums will succumb to black knot, and there's virtually nothing you can do short of a heavy duty chemicals to try to combat it. But if you're willing to have a go at it, then go ahead. I can't give you good advice on how to prune your plums, because every time I tried to prune my plums in Ontario, all I got was a bush. They reacted with a hairbrush of new growth, and it rapidly lost its shape. But that may be because I wasn't smart enough at that time. That was a long time ago, so I haven't tried it since.
And another question from Elizabeth, are you going to be getting into like organic cultivation and growing without use of pesticides?
More or less, yes. After the next pause, we will talk about that.
Okay, all right.
Okay. So let's go on then with the.
Could I ask a quick question?
Yes.
Sure.
Just wondering about timing. I'm very new to this, and my understanding is sort of like February is the best time for like pruning. I'm calling from Newfoundland. Is it too late now for pruning? And does grafting follow the same timeline as pruning, or does it matter when you do that?
Okay, the answer is no, it is not too late at all for pruning.
Not too late for pruning or grafting.
Well, so you can prune quite happily now. You can prune up until the leaves come out.
Okay.
Grafting, your grafting wood, your scion wood, must be dormant. The rootstock, what you're grafting it onto, can be dormant or it can be growing. And I actually prefer to graft onto actively growing rootstock because basically the tree will heal itself because it's got sap coming up from the roots, which then cause the damage that you have created with your grafting to heal. So your grafting wood must be dormant. So it means that you had to cut it before the buds swell. In Newfoundland, you're probably still okay, depending on where you are, to rush out and cut scionwood from the neighbor's most desirable tree if you want. And we can talk about that in a moment. But in general, we are probably getting into a little late for cutting scionwood. And all the scionwood that I have, and that's in my list there, was cut a month ago, stored in the fridge, and we just keep storing it until it's time to graft it. Okay.
All
So
right.
now,
Thank you, Lori. Good to see you, by the way. Oh, David,
Hi, nice to see you.
why don't you carry on, David?
okay. So how about I grow my own tree rather than going off to the nursery or asking David Maxwell to sell me a tree. I'll do my own grafting. So we'll talk about grafting first. What is it? It's very simple. You just put the cambium layers from two different plants together. Ta-da. Oh yeah. What is the cambium? Well, the cambium is that green line of living cells under the bark, between the bark and the wood. This display here, this picture here is not actually of an apple because the cambium in an apple twig isn't nearly as thick as this. It's much finer than this, but I used it because it makes it more obvious what I'm talking about when I say the green layer. They're green because those are living cells. The bark is dead. The wood on the inside of the thing, this here, is dead. And it's gone. So the only bit that is still living is this green layer here. So all you got to do to graft is to get the cambium on one bit married with the cambium on the other bit. And it's as simple as that. So terminology, the scion is the top. That's the desired variety. So if you want to grow a sops of wine apple, you get a scion of sops of wine and you set it aside in a nice cool place while you wait for the rootstock to be ready. The rootstock is the bottom part. And if you are doing something fancy, like having a well-anchored rootstock, like an MM111 or something, and you don't want a tree 20 feet high, you can put a piece of something like M9 or Ottawa 3 between the two pieces, and you end up with something with the benefit of both. So here's an illustration of what we're talking about. This is the scion up at the top, and this is the rootstock. And here's the graft union where they join together. As I said at the beginning, I can't really instruct you in how to actually do it on a computer-based thing like this. my contribution in the past was hands-on and close hands-on, close supervision. And I'm not prepared now in this era to do that. I'm spooked, I'm old, and I don't want to get COVID, so I'm not doing it. I'm going to refer you to other people's videos of how to do grafting. And there's a list of video resources on the Transition Bay site, which was already noted. Basically, I would cite one group that does probably the best illustration of exactly how to do whip and tongue grafting, which is what I'm going to talk about primarily. And the second resource, primary resource, is a rather wild physician, again, in Britain, by the name of Hayes, Dr. Hayes, who's actually a dermatologist, but you'd never know it. He's a rough, he looks like a country bumpkin, but he's extremely knowledgeable, and he's very good in his instruction. And his thing is what's called I've forgotten the name of it now. He's got his own graft that he loves. I have tried to do it. I'm nowhere near as good at it as he is, but if you get it going, it works well. And we'll get to it in a moment. So what we're going to concentrate now on is so-called whip and tongue grafting. And it's the same principles apply to all the other graftings as apply with whip and tongue. So here we go. What do I need to do the grafting? Well, you need rootstocks. You can get rootstocks from Maple Grove up in the valley. You can get rootstocks from Whiffletree, and I don't know whether Whiffletree will ship rootstocks at this season. They may have said that it's too late in the season, but they may be quite happy to do it. And basically, you got to talk to them if you want to get your rootstocks from them. Scotian Gold will happily provide bundles of rootstocks, but they require that you tell them in November what you want for the following spring. So they're out for this year. I have some rootstocks in my orchard. So if you can't find things elsewhere, contact me and I will see whether I can help you. You need scionwood. So where are you going to get your scionwood from? Well, the Canadian Clonal Gene Bank is the national gene bank where all the heritage varieties are supposed to be stored. And most countries in the world have parallel gene banks. And in fact, they've now combined the websites for, I think, probably all the countries in the world, which is why the URL has acquired the name Grin Global. Grin was the American database of what they had in the States. We then had a grin.ca or grin-ca for the Canadian one. And now they've gone to Grin Global. It's not easy. It's not user-friendly. And we have a problem in Canada that Agriculture Canada got into a bun fight at the higher levels of their organization about 7 or 8 years ago, and fired the woman who was running their gene bank. And the person who replaced her is less interested, and the administration of Agriculture Canada is less interested. So the whole thing has kind of deteriorated over the past 5, 6, 7 years, but they still have, at least in theory, they have a lot of things that you won't find anywhere else, because that's their job. They're supposed to be keeping a record of and example trees of everything that they had, and there was at least 4,000 different varieties that they were supposed to be looking after, but they are less reliable now than they were in the past. Where else? You can get Cyanwood from the Facebook groups, the Canadian Cyan and Edible Plant Exchange, which is a Facebook group, and NAFEX, which was North American Fruit Explorers. They go back to the 1950s or earlier, and they've gone through a number of iterations, but basically they are fruit explorers and aficionados of fruit. So you can generally get things from them. The problem again is you can't get anything across the border. You cannot get Cyanwood across the border from the States. It's blocked at the border, and there's a history there as well. What happened was a plum grower in the Niagara illegally imported some Cyanwood from New York, and he brought in plumpox virus, which was not present in Canada at that point. So he introduced plumpox virus, and the Agriculture Canada then said, then that's the end of that. Nobody gets anything across this border again, ever. So we are closed down solidly. So the only sources that you can get things from are in Canada. O'Keefe Grange is an orchard and nursery in Ontario. They have a lot of different varieties. Again, I don't know whether they can provide you with Cyanwood for this season, but what you do is you say, oh, look, I really want to get Cyanwood of sops of wine or whatever, and he may well have it. He's got a lot of things, and he'll cut it and send it to you. Generally, there's a sort of an unwritten fee for about $5 for Cyanwood. Salt Spring Apple Company and Denman Island Heritage Apples have enormous collections of apples. There was, in the past, in the early 1900s, there was a very vigorous apple growing on the West Coast. This has died out in the East, but it persisted on the islands off Vancouver. So these are two islands or two companies on Salt Spring Island, well, on Salt Spring and Denman Island, which is nearby, who have thousands of different varieties, and they have websites of their own. Go and look on them and you can see all the various apple trees that they have. Again, if you talk nicely to them, they will send you Cyanwood. There's an angle in this that you're not allowed to import Cyanwood from BC, but the reason for that is because BC has apple ermine moth that nobody east of the Rockies has, so they don't want you bringing in apple ermine moth. There is no apple ermine moth on Salt Spring or Denman Island, and so it's probably a perfectly safe thing to do. But if you really want to be careful, you can take your Cyanwood when you get it from them and soak it in what's the stinky stuff that you sterilize things with? Yeah, I've lost the word.
You don't mean bleach?
Yeah,
or-
bleach. Soak it
Oh.
in bleach solution for 5 minutes and that kills everything. But it doesn't affect the signwood, doesn't matter. And again, I've got on the Transition Bay site, I've got a list of all the things that I've got, and you can get those now from me. So you don't even have to wait for next year or search elsewhere. What else do you need? You need supplies. You need a knife. Well, these two are dedicated grafting knives. They are made with a flat back and a tapered front. And that, at least in theory, allows you to make a nice flat, straight cut. I'm not wholly convinced that it actually makes a difference, but the gospel is that if you want to make a really flat cut, you have to use a grafting knife. I actually have a supply of grafting knives that I got again from my grafting workshop a number of years ago. So I've got 20 of these darn things. If anybody wants a grafting knife, I will sell you a grafting knife at cost, $20. Bob's your uncle, and I will make sure that they get up to Transition Bay for pickup. You can equally well use a plain knife, the kind of utility knife. Where's this guy? So a utility knife works quite satisfactorily. It gives you a nice straight cut. The only harm or the only difficulty that I've experienced using a utility knife like this is it's got an awful short blade, so it's much more difficult to sort of slice through the wood. But other than that, it works well. The little fine ones, the thin ones, don't work. They're too flexible. You need a one with a solid blade. You're going to have to bind things together. You can bind them together with parafilm, which is a stretchy plastic tape that wraps around and sticks to itself and deteriorates. It's soft. It deteriorates with time, and it is thin enough and soft enough that the buds will break right through it. So it doesn't inhibit growth. It doesn't girdle the graft. And if you're using it for budding, which we will get to in the end, the bud will push right through it. It doesn't matter. But again, this is sort of commercial. You don't actually need it. And for a long time, I used plain electrical tape like this, just regular electrician's tape. The only harm with that is you have to slit it once your graft is taken so as to release the graft, because the graft is going to expand and the electrical tape will compress it and make it difficult. This is a piece of scrap plywood with a hole drill in the middle to slip over the end of your scion, and you will see in a moment why. I don't use it, but for security and for reassurance, that is one way to make the process less scary, because you're working with a very sharp blade and it's very easy for the blade to slip and cut you. And I can speak to that by personal experience because I cut my left index finger doing exactly that. I've got a little smarter since then. Next is a label. You must label your tree because you will forget what the hell it is, almost guaranteed. So what are you going to label it with? Well, the only thing that I have found that actually works and lives on for more than a year is vinyl siding cut into pieces, and then I engrave the vinyl siding with a buzz engraver, and I put the name of the thing and when it was grafted and what the rootstock is and so on the label. And then if you rub a little dirt into it, the dirt makes the writing stand out. And that has lasted. That lasts indefinitely. Okay, then you're going to seal the thing to stop it drying out. You can use tree sealants of various kinds. This particular one is something called lac balsam, and I like it. It's a lovely stuff to work with. It's a sort of a latex-based stuff. You slop it on, and it works exceedingly well. But you can also use just plain roof patch that you get at your local hardware store, and it works perfectly well. It seals it up, and it doesn't harm the tree in any way. The trees don't mind. So that's cheap, that's available. You don't have to go looking for anything else. But if you want all these fancy things, I can probably supply enough for you to do whatever you want to do. And again, I would truck it up to Transition Bay for you to pick up from them. And you see, I don't want to get too close to you. So we'll talk about whip and tongue grafting after that long preamble. Whip and tongue grafting, what you do is you cut off the scion in a slope. You cut off, sorry, the rootstock in a slope. You cut off the scion in a slope, and you cut a length. You can make a cut into the ends of each one. It's cutting this cut when your blade slips and cuts your finger. You then simply plug the two of them in together, wrap them up together, and they grow together over the next 6 or 8 weeks, by which time they're completely healed in and the thing is solid. Here is an example. We've sliced this off at an angle, matched it with, and as you can see, they more or less match in size and shape. You can see the cut in the end here and the cut here, the tongue, and we shove them together, and that's what they look like. As long as the cambium layers are close to each other, they will grow together. Now, actually, I've got these out of sequence, or I've deleted one that was designed to show what I wanted to show, because as you can see here, the cambium layer is not absolutely matched over much of the distance here. That won't stick together well, but the other side of this was carefully matched so that the cambium layers lie directly on top of each other. So as long as at least one side is matched, they will grow together quite happily. This one also will match out at the end of the tongue here. So from here on out is in contact with cambium, and that's good solid union. And apples are exceedingly forgiving. They will let you get away with just about anything. Again, here's a picture of the gap where it's not totally matched, but it's good enough. And all this bit down here is entirely tight and solid, and that's all matched. So that will grow beautifully. It's not a bad graft. Here it's wrapped simply with electrician tape. And this is one that was grafted earlier in the season. It has grown, it is stuck together, and I have split the electrician's tape with a sharp blade lengthwise. You just cut one cut lengthwise, and don't try to peel it off. If you try to peel it off, you will take off some of the bark with it. So just make a slit the length of it and leave it, and it'll fall off in due course, and it won't inhibit the tree. This is using parafilm instead. That you don't have to cut, you don't have to take it off, and it does exactly the same job. All right. Saddle graft. This is what Dr. Hayes likes. It makes a beautiful graft. It's got a lot of contact, but in the scion wood, but it's much more difficult to do. What you're doing here is you cut the scion in a V shape. So we've got the cambium exposed on both sides of the V, lots of space, and we make a matching cut in the end of the rootstock and goes the other way. This is the rootstock. This is the scion, sorry. So this is the rootstock cut in a V. This is the scion wood cut in a matching V. And this was a mistake. When I cut this, it's split lengthwise. It won't matter. It won't matter 2 hoots because that split will immediately heal itself back together. But the end result is you end up with this. So again, cambium matched reasonably well. This one here actually is matched even better on the other side. And you bind it all together. It'll squeeze this in tightly and it'll all grow back happily. And it makes a beautiful graft, but it is not as easy to do. You need to practice for a lot of time before you do this. And in fact, you probably want to practice a lot before you do any of the grafts. Just get some scrap wood and practice and practice and practice. And when you're satisfied that you got it down pat, then go get your good scion wood and graft it. Now, here's a whole list of other kinds of grafts. You don't need to pay a lot of attention other than be aware that you can do this. So here is one way of doing a side graft. All you're doing is putting your scion into the rootstock, binding it together with the cambium in place, and it'll heal. Here is one that was done last season. And as you can see, this is the scion that I put into it. Here is the stalk into which it was put. This was actually a branch of a tree in my orchard. And this spring, what I'm going to do is cut this off obliquely here because I don't want this wood out here. So I cut it following across there, and this will then form the new branch. Top working. With an established tree, or with a big rootstock and small scion wood, you can split the wood. You've now got cambium exposed here and here. You plug your scion in on each side. You pry this apart with a screwdriver or something so that it springs apart. Plug your scions in, pull the screwdriver out. The wood will spring back, provide lots of pressure to hold it together. And then you wrap it up and slaughter it with something to stop it drying out, which can be as simple as tar, roof seal, or you can use something more fancy if you wish. But the end result is you seal it all up. Here, I've actually wrapped it with electrician's tape and then covered it with black tar. And these are 2 scions that have grown out. I'm going to cut this guy off. Now, what I did, in fact, with this one was cut obliquely down here. And here's, oops, no, don't end the show. Damn. That's what I did, is I cut it, leaving only the good one that had grown out. I don't like that because it left a cavity here. And there's no way to avoid that. If you split the thing, you've got that cavity, there's no way to get around it. So I'm not sure that's a good way to deal with it, but if you cut the other one off flush, you still have a hole in the middle. And again, there's no way around that. So what you need to do then is to go with a different process, a bark graft, which has been done since this was a book published in the Middle Ages showing how to do bark grafting. What he's done is plug scions into the top of a cut off tree using a sort of hook arrangement. And here's a picture of people doing it. Make a nice long tongue on your scion, fasten it into the bark, lift the bark up, fasten it into the bark with the cambium in contact with the cambium. So you can only do this when you can lift the cambium, which means that it has to be in fruit. It has to be living. It has to be early in the season. The sap isn't flowing, and you can't separate the bark from the rest of the tree until the sap is flowing freely. So when it is flowing freely, you cut a little flap or something in the top of the tree, plug your scion into it, and here is one scion plugged into the end of the plug there. This one was done with 3 scions plugged into the end. You can see they've taken beautifully. They are in fact all growing. And I think what I'm going to do with this particular one is cut that off flush, and let the one grow out. You don't want to have 3 branches is what it comes down to. Just in passing, this stuff here is scab, apple scab, which on the leaves doesn't really matter, as long as it's not too much. But people get upset about it. Here is an orchard which somebody is working over from their original variety onto different varieties. So you can do this in your backyard. If you have a wild apple tree, for example, you will lop things off and bark graft into the cut off ends all the way down this row. And here is what it looked like a couple of years later. So they were grafted here, they were grafted here, they were grafted here, and here. All these extra growths actually need to be trimmed off, but you can see you can make a complete new tree simply by doing all this. And just for amusement, if you want, there is something called a banana graft, which you need to use if you're doing nut grafting nut trees. And what you're doing there is you peel the bark back, cut it off on the rootstock, and make a piece on the top of the scion wood to match those flaps, those bark flaps that you turn back. And then when you're making your original flaps, you have a rubber band on the base. And so you just roll the rubber band up, that holds everything together, wrap it up with something. And here is the tree a few years later. Here it is that spring. Here it is a couple of years later. If your trees get girdled by the rabbits, you can repair them by grafting in bits of rootstock or grafting pieces of scion wood across the girdle from one side to the other. And there is one that has been put in place to replace the tree that got girdled, although that doesn't show the girdle. So here is what happens. That was eaten off. That was utterly destroyed. I grafted in some pieces up here. So from the ground up, and grafted them into here. And within, this doesn't advance, within a year, that's what the bit that I grafted in looked like. And over the succeeding time, that has got even bigger. So now the tree, in fact, is supported by these pieces that I grafted in. And the original tree, this bit here is completely dead because there's no bark. And last, if you miss the spring, because grafting is something you do in the spring, If you miss your opportunity, you can then do budding later in the season, in which basically you take a bud from a rapid or an actively growing tree, you cut it off and you graft it in to your root stock, your whatever it is that you're grafting it into. And actually, that's the way most trees are produced commercially. Most commercial growers don't actually do grafting, as I've gone through there. So here's two ways of doing this. This is a tea bud. You cut your bud off the bud stick. You got this little bit here. There's a bud in there. You then make a slit in the root, and you lift the sides of the slit up, slide your bud into it so that the cambium on the back of this mates up with the cambium on the stalk. Bind it all up. Here, using the polyfilm is a good idea because you don't have to worry about taking it off. You can do exactly the same thing using bread wrapper, the plastic from a bread wrapper. Cut into strips, you wrap it up. The only difficulty there is you need to unwrap it or cut it once the bud has taken. This bud probably will not grow this year. So all you can expect is that it marries itself to the rootstock, and next spring it'll sprout. And once it's sprouted, you cut off the stalk above it so that the tree is all what you just budded into it. Chip budding you can do earlier in the season because the bark doesn't have to slip. So you cut a notch down, you cut down into it, so you've made a little nest for your bud to sit in. You then cut your bud to match there, so it's got a little slice that matches with that, and the back side of it matches with that. You bind it all together and it sticks and it grows again, usually the following year. Okay, so that's covered an awful lot about grafting, and everything beyond that you're going to have to get by going to the web. Questions? Oop, Bob, there we go. Turn yourself on. Good.
I've got a few that in the chat box. Elizabeth was asking, when you were talking about the sources of scion wood and you were talking about Denman and Salt Spring Island.
Yeah.
Elizabeth is asking, which varieties from BC would do well on the East Coast? Anything come to mind?
Probably virtually everything that they have, because most of what they have is North American. And just as the trees, the apples migrated from Kazakhstan into Europe and then into Britain, because the Brits brought things with them, the British varieties largely didn't do terribly well in North America. So the apples continued to evolve in North America. And so most of what we have, in fact, is North American that grew from things that were brought over from Britain in the 1700s. So anything that is newer than the 1700s is probably a native North American thing. The thing that makes the most difference, probably, unless you're in an area where you are really cold, there are varieties that will not do well in very cold areas of Canada, for example. But our climate is very similar to that out on the West Coast. There are some varieties of apples, for example, winter banana, that grow well in more southern climates. They don't do as well in northern areas because they are not cold tolerant. The other aspect of this is that many varieties of apple that we grow need a long period of cold in order to respond the following year. So if they don't get an adequate cold period, they won't grow. So that's a long way of saying that in general, anything that you get from the West Coast is likely to work fine here, but I don't think it would necessarily work fine in Manitoba or Alberta. So,
Okay. Thank you. Question from Jane. She's got an apple tree. It's been girdled above the graft line by a vole.
yep.
And now there's shoots coming from the rootstock, but
Yep.
the top is dead.
Yep. Oh, he's dead. Oh,
Yeah, so she wants to know if she can graft something new onto the rootstock.
oh, absolutely. Absolutely. That's exactly what I would recommend, because you've now got a solidly established root. And if you graft on top of that, it's going to grow with great vigor. It's going to put on a lot of growth because you've got a huge root ball already established with its fungi nourishing it and everything. It's no, that's exactly what you do.
So that's a great opportunity for Jane then to try grafting, it sounds like.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Absolutely.
all right. Jane needs some scion wood, sounds like. I've got a question myself. I've got a Honeycrisp that just as you were showing that damaged trunk down low,
Yeah.
it picked up a lot of damage. It's recovering pretty well, but it's probably going to start rotting inside a little bit. So I'd like to do a rescue graft like you showed. So do I need to plant rootstock down around the base? Or how would I, where does that come from out of the soil?
Okay, well, you can, but it's your assumption that it's going to rot is not necessarily so at all. In general, exposed wood, as long as it's not in the soil, simply sits there indefinitely. Nothing bad happens, and the bark around the edges of that exposed area simply calluses in. And if you look at trees in general, you'll find there are spots all over the tree where there are big calluses with open wood in the center that sits there for
Okay,
hundreds of years.
so should I bother to cover it with tar or anything, the exposed wood, or just let it?
There's
keep
no
going?
benefit. There's no
Okay.
benefit in trying to cover it with anything. If there is an adequate amount of bark remaining or of living tissue remaining, you simply carry on.
Okay,
But you do something to stop the critters from eating the tree again next year. So use some kind of trunk protector. What I use, in fact, is Big O, slit lengthwise, and put that on in the fall, and that protects it from gnawing critters. Parenthetically, it is highly unlikely that it was a vole that made that cutting or that chewing, because voles are very small and they don't climb. So they will chew right at soil line, but they don't get up the trunk. It's much more likely to be something like a rabbit.
Okay. All right. Thank you. David's got
Or actually, I had another thought. The other thing that it could be would be an insect, a borer, that gets into the tree, eats into the tree and eats the cambium layer, at which point the bark sloughs off because there's no longer any living tissue under it. So that's, in fact, that's how that tree that I had a bridge graft on, that's what happened to the bark on that. It was destroyed by apple tree, round-headed apple tree borer. And to answer the second question that you put, how do you get the wood to jump over? You can plant rootstock around, a couple of rootstocks around. If the rootstock has sprouted, which it often does, you can bend in some of those sprouts, use them. And the alternative is to cut pieces of cyanwood, long pieces, and graft in to the root and up the top as a bridge.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, good. Thank you. David's got a question. What is Big O?
Oh, Big O is the big plastic, the black plastic pipe that's used for drainage.
Okay. Okay.
It's sort of big, flexible black plastic pipe. You cut it into lengths and then split it lengthwise and pry it over the tree. And by the time the tree has got to the size that you can no longer get it on, which is 4 inches, it's 4 inches in diameter. So anything beyond 4 inches, you can't do it. But by that point, the bark is usually thick enough that it doesn't get eaten. It's only the nice new soft bark that the critters go after.
Yeah, we have a small orchard close to a river, and the neighbors found signs of beaver.
Yep.
You know, very characteristic cone shaped. And I heard of one person that in one evening beavers dropped like 6 apple trees in an orchard.
Yep.
So what do you recommend we put around the trunk to protect against beavers?
You can try the heavy metal mesh, but you need the heavier gauge. Something like window screening won't do it at all. You need solid mesh, metal mesh to protect it. Yeah,
like hardware cloth. It's
hardware cloth, but the heavier gauge hardware cloth. That's the word I want.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
David, I have a question. And in your list, I didn't see Jonah gold for the cyanwoods that you had, but I recently had some Jonah gold apples, and I was really impressed with the flavor and the fact that they had kept so well all this time. And I would really like to get a tree or more of that. What do you suggest? What do you like? What do you think of the Jonah Golds?
I think the Jonah Gold is an excellent apple. It's a superb apple. It's relatively recent. It's a cross of Jonathan and Golden Delicious. And it has most of the good qualities of both, and it's unusually flavorful for a modern apple. So yeah, I'm a fan of Jonah Gold, and it's disease resistant as well. So I don't, as you say, I don't have a Jonah Gold apple, but I have had in the past, and there are lots of people who do have it. So I can very readily find people who have Jonagold apple, and depending on whether they have cut signwood and stored it away, we may or may not be able to get it this year, but we certainly can get it for next year without any question.
Do you have any heritage apples that have those characteristics?
Yes, I would think that. Let me think about that, and
Okay.
I will feed back to you my suggestions as to something that is close to that.
Lori
Okay.
has her hand raised.
Okay. Lori is,
Do I understand correctly too, that you can graft a number of varieties onto one variety? So I have a wild apple, like a crab apple, I think,
Yep.
on a property I'm working at. So I can put a number of different scions onto the wild tree, correct?
absolutely.
Yeah.
And the fellow who was growing potatoes in California, his name keeps escaping me. He actually grafted 100 varieties of apple onto one tree, basically to see if he could do it. And he could. The only problem with grafting multiple varieties, well, actually, there's several problems. One is that they will tend to grow at different rates. So you end up with branches that are longer, thicker, and stouter than the other branches that tend to sort of outgrow the rest of the tree. If you are grafting multiple varieties, if any of the varieties you graft on have a virus, a latent virus, that virus will then spread into the tree and into all the other varieties. And the variety that you are grafting on with the virus may not be aware of having a virus. It doesn't matter to it, because some varieties don't display any harm by having a virus, but other varieties with that same virus are seriously impaired in their growth. So you will infect your whole tree with that virus inadvertently. And so if you're getting signwood from any sort of official site, they will insist that you have only virus indexed signwood, meaning it has been checked for all the known viruses. And the way, in fact, they check it is they graft it onto some rootstocks that are known to be particularly susceptible to those particular viruses. And if they don't make it there, then they are deemed dirty and they don't let them out the door. But they can, if they are so inclined, get rid of the viruses in the greenhouse by a rather complex process. You sort of force the plant to grow very quickly with extra heat, and then you cut off the very tip because the plant will outgrow the virus. And then you graft that back into something. So you're dealing in large measure with very small pieces of wood. And so it's not something that is done lightly, and most of the older varieties have never been virus indexed, and nobody's going to bother to do it. So if you want to grow something that, like pomme gris, which dates back to the 1500s and is a superb russeted apple. It's by far the best russeted apple that I have, that I know. But nobody is going to have virus indexed pomme gris. So I grow quite happily, I grow pomme gris, but I grow it only on the one tree so that I don't infect something else inadvertently if there is a virus in there. And I have no idea whether this virus is in there.
Mhm.
because it
Mm.
doesn't matter with the pomme gris.
So
It's
David,
rather complex, wasn't it? Is that all right? Did that answer your question?
I think so, yes, yeah.
I have an adjunct question onto the grafting onto old established crabapple, which Thomas Dietz had asked almost the same question as Lori was asking. But if you're doing that, isn't that the time when you would be best to do this grafting where you start with a little bit of scion from a rootstock that's not going to grow so big, and then the scion of the roots of the one you want for your actual apples, right?
I'm not sure that I understood the question. What you do if you have a wild apple, you lop the ends off the branches, as was in the pictures back. Where are we? There. You lop the ends off things, plug bits of scion wood into the end of the cut off branches, and those will grow out. Within a couple of years, that's what you'll have.
How do you control it to keep it to be a smaller apple?
If you don't want a full-size tree, as this is, then you do indeed need to graft onto a dwarfing rootstock of some sort. So yes, you're absolutely right in that sense. I have never heard of anybody trying to interpose an interstem branch between an established seedling root and a desired variety. I think if you want a dwarf or semi-dwarf tree, you go to a dwarf or semi-dwarf rootstock. Don't try to do this, because you'll get a full-size tree if you do this. Okay, we need to go on to the last bit, and because we're going to run out of time otherwise. I'm actually doing rather well. I'm rather surprised how well this is done. So planting. The main thing here is dig a big hole, 22 to 24 inches. You cannot make your hole too big. Many years ago, I was planting tiny little Aleppo pines on hillside in Algeria, reforesting hillsides that had been barren of vegetation for 15 centuries. And we were recreating the hillsides that had been barren for 15 centuries. We dug, our little trees that we were planting were about 6 inches high. I insisted that the holes that were dug were a full meter in size. And those trees now are magnificent. They're full-size trees. The hills are green with growth that there has been nothing there for 15 centuries. And now we have reforested, revegetated an entire area. But it depended on digging a big hole. Okay. Message clear. Pruning and training. What do you do once you've got your tree? Just to get nomenclature, thinning is done at the base of the of a sprout, and heading you cut right off beyond a bud, and the bud behind that will grow. So you cut here, the bud here will grow next year. You cut here, the bud here will grow. And actually, you can see what's happening here. These 3 cuts here have been made, and the following year, this is what has grown out because the buds behind it have sprouted. So we've got a couple of buds here, and they sprouted and made these branches here. So if you want to make more branches, you cut beyond a bud. If you want to stop branches growing, you cut off right at the base of the cut so that it doesn't make any more growth. And here is the, here is the 1-year whip. This is the tree that has been grafted. Last year, it has grown. And in my case, in my garden here, it had grown to, in most cases, about 6 feet. I have, in fact, cut them off at about 3 feet, 3.5 feet high. The buds below where I cut them off are going to sprout like this. So this is the next year. And all these buds down below are going to make new grafts, new branches. You then thin those out. If you got more branches than you want, in this case, you want about 2 to 3 branches in a couple of layers to make a sort of Christmas tree shape with a modified central leader. This is where we cut this off. It has sprouted and it tends to grow up, which is what you want to do. And then you may cut that off again and it'll make another sprout up top. So you got a piece in the middle that grows up and you got pieces along the side that make new branches. That is how most apple trees in North America are pruned. In Britain, they lop them off sort of here, and they make a vase shape without a central leader. And that, in fact, since somebody was asking about peaches, that's how you grow your peaches. You lop it off once you got it to the height you want. You lop it off, and everything then consists of branches coming out the side. So here this at the end of year 2, it looks like this. It has now grown another year and we've got all these extra growth. We thin that out to maintain a skeleton, a framework along the design that we want. So we got a restricted number of branches coming out the side. Things are growing up top because we were allowed it to grow up. Our framework branches here have persisted. They've been like that. Here they are, here, 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 and here. Those are still present. And everything else is up here. We have cut off the ends of branches to make them branch again. And we keep doing that to keep the thing spreading out with extra branches. It'll form a new sprout or a new branch at the bud just below where we cut, and for several back beyond that. Okay. I don't know whether that makes sense, but that's what you're going to get. Diseases and pests. Apple scab. People don't like scab on their apples. It's entirely cosmetic. It doesn't matter if you've got scab on your apples, unless it's really severe, in which case the apples crack and rot. But a bit of scab on an apple is purely cosmetic. It doesn't affect the taste. It doesn't affect the keeping qualities or anything else. Actually, there is a school that says that with cider apples, you actually want to encourage scab because it improves the taste, improves the quality. The way I deal with scab is I grow scab-free varieties, things that are naturally resistant to scab in the first place, unless there's something that I really particularly want. But by and large, I select my varieties to be relatively scab resistant, and most of the older varieties are scab resistant. The new ones that are bred as scab resistant, anything with a Nova in the name. So Nova, Nova whatever, were bred in Kentville using a gene, a single gene from an apple, a crab apple that is naturally resistant to scab. So they bred in scab resistant. To my mind, I don't think that any of the Nova series are nearly as good as the things that they were grafting into, or that they were breeding into. So I'm not a fan of modern scab-free apples, is the bottom line. But most of the trees that I have in my orchard are scab-free or highly resistant to scab by means other than this one gene that is derived from the crab apple and that has been bred into all sorts of supposedly scab-free varieties, which are no longer being nearly as scab-free because nature has rapidly figured out how to get around this one gene. And so now our modern growth is not nearly as scab-free as it was meant to be. Cankers. Some varieties are rather sensitive to apple canker, which are black growths on the bark. It destroys the bark and eats into the bark. It's a fungus. How you deal with it is there's a number of ways you can do it. You can, traditionally what you do is you cut it out and then burn the cuttings to get rid of it. That works if it's in an area where you can safely cut it out without destroying the tree. If it's on the main trunk, you can't cut it out because that involves cutting the whole damn tree. So it doesn't work as well. One thing that was suggested, and that I think is actually rather clever, is to get a blowtorch and burn it out on the tree. It's rather labor intensive, but it does work. So that's the other thing you can do, is to paint it with copper. Borrow something, borrow's solution, but
Bordeaux mix or
Bordeaux mix. There we are. Good.
yeah.
Bordeaux mix will kill the virus, kill the fungus as well. So clean it out, paint it with Bordeaux mixture, and that may work. None of this is guaranteed, and this is nature. You cannot eliminate all disease. You do what is best. To my mind, I'm willing to let nature have 15 to 20% of my trees and crop, and as long as it leaves me 80%. Peach leaf curl responds very well to sulfur sprayed in the fall and spring. But if you don't spray it with sulfur, you will probably have peach leaf curl, which causes the leaves to curl up and eventually starves the tree, and you don't make peaches anymore. But that's a period of years before it gets to that point. Borers, which I referred to before, the main thing here is keep an eye out, watch out for them. You can see them. They make little tunnels with yellow stinky frass that comes out of the little hole. So there's a tiny little pinhole with this yellow stinky frass that is coming out. And the frass is simply the poop of the worm that's on the inside. That worm is eating the cambium of your tree and you want to get rid of it. Traditionally, what they say is you poke a thin wire into the hole and you impale the worm. That works as long as it hasn't been there long enough for it to make a winding passageway that you can't get your wire into. You can, in that case, you can cut into the tree with a sharp blade, follow the passage of the worm until you get to the end and squish it and get rid of it. You can inject things into the hole, and I have tried that. You can, there's a number of things that you can do. You can make a concoction of moth flakes in an oil, like olive oil or something, inject that into the hole, and the moth flakes are camphor. The camphor kills the critter. Be warned that if you do that with a plastic syringe, the camphor makes the syringe dissolve after a short time. So you're somewhat limited. But if you don't want to get a syringe, incidentally, this is something that is sometimes useful. If you want to get a syringe, you go to the co-op where they're sold for veterinary use. So anybody that has cows and horses and things has free access to syringes and needles at the co-op. If you go to a drugstore, they won't give them to you because they say you're going to use them for illicit purposes. European apple sawfly is an imported critter. It attacks the fruit. It won't do any harm to your tree, but it will wreck your fruit. And what it does, the female sawfly goes to the fruitlet while it's still in bloom. And there's very few things that attack your fruit during bloom time. They usually attack it after bloom. But it goes to the tree in fruit, in bloom, and the female saws a little slit in the base of the fruitlet and deposits its eggs in there. The eggs hatch, the worm crawls out and eats along the surface of the fruit as it's growing, because by now we're past the bloom stage. So it leaves a winding path on the surface, and then it migrates into other fruit, and it can migrate into as many as 5 other apples, each time eating into the apple and progressively destroying those apples as well. So the first bunch, you get only basically cosmetic damage with this winding path on the surface, but the fruit underneath remains good. The subsequent ones, the fruit is no longer usable, and it generally dies and falls off. What do you do about that? It's difficult because anything you spray is being sprayed at a time that the pollinators are pollinating. So you don't want to kill them. I have a solution which works, which comes from Europe, basically. It is an extract of a tropical shrub called Quassia amara that is, you spray it on the tree while it's in bloom. It kills off the European apple sawfly, but it's not approved for use in North America. It's approved for use in Europe, but not in North America. And we are working on that. We have done some experiments, and we're trying to get it listed as an extra use of that is outside the usual framework of restrictions. Codling moth does much the same thing as a European apple sawfly. It burrows into the core of your apple. So if in subsequent years, you find that the inside, the core of the apple has been eaten out. It was eaten out either by the European apple sawfly or by a codling moth. The codling moth occurs just after petal fall. So you got to go at it with something at that point. You can do it with, we're getting into more complex things here in terms of organic management. There are organic things that are readily available and work, but are not available to the retail market. You can buy them only if you have a pesticide applicator certificate, which you can get from the province by writing an exam. You probably should study the book before writing the exam, but it's a pretty simple exam and you can actually guess the answers for most of the questions. So you could probably get enough points to actually get your pesticide applicator certificate, which will then cost you $50. You then take that along to the feed store or wherever, and you can buy a number of things that are effective against codling moth. And again, if somebody wants to pursue this, I would suggest they contact me and I will advise them rather than wasting more time advising, because unless you go get your pesticide applicator certificates, you can't really do very much organically. Apple maggot is a fly that lays its eggs in the fruit in August. And it's the thing that's people call railroad worm. It's the thing that leaves the brown tracks all through the flesh of the apple. I, in fact, have done virtually nothing about apple maggot in my orchard because I have found that I don't have much of a problem. It doesn't really affect my fruit. A couple of years, I was using an organic treatment to kill off apple maggots. And I may actually have simply eliminated it from my orchard, and they're not flying in from elsewhere. Aphids, aphids can be a problem. They damage the trees, the leaves, and weaken the tree. And they are best managed with stick them around the trunk, because the aphids are being nourished by or farmed by ants. So if you stop the ants climbing up the tree, you can get rid of the aphids. The aphids die off, in fact. Mullein bug, you may or may not have problems depending on whether you have mullein, which is a weed. The mullein bug, again, will damage your trees to some degree, but generally it's acceptable damage. The caterpillar complex are the things that eat your leaves in the spring and again in the fall. You can get it then with BT, which you can buy on the retail market. So spray them with BT or BTK, and that generally controls them. Rodents and deer. Rodents, you put some kind of protector on the trunks, particularly over the winter. Deer, there is nothing that works for a deer other than lead or a 10 to 12 foot fence. They will go over an 8-foot fence. I have watched them do it. I watched a little doe in the orchard when my fence was only 8 feet high. She caught sight of me, decided she should leave. She strolled over to the fence and from a standing start, levitated over an 8-foot fence and then strolled off into the woods. It's awesome. They're impressive, but they sure as hell can do a lot of damage to your trees. And the only thing I know is a really high fence. I have tried baiting my fence with electrified wire with little nests of peanut butter. They come and lick up the peanut butter. They love it. And they get a hell of a jolt on their tongues, which in theory deters them from doing it again. It doesn't. It just makes them mad and they knock the fence down. And I don't know any other way than to make a really high fence around your tree if you have problems with deer. And we in Lunenburg have the highest deer population in Nova Scotia. I don't know what it's like up closer to Halifax. It's probably less of a problem than we have, but you have to do that with whatever your local conditions demand. Here's a list of resources. This is also on the website for where you can get information and chat with like-minded aficionados. And you can contact me as well. And I think that's the end of that. So if you have more questions, ask away until we
David,
get turned off.
Perfect timing. We've got a little bit time left. I do want to throw in one thing real quick about deer. One thing that we've done very successfully is a fence around each tree.
Yeah.
So 4 posts about
Yep.
a foot away. And these are like 1, 2, 3, 4-year-old saplings. 4 posts around each tree with chicken wire.
Yep.
So there's nothing to jump over because it's so close to the tree, but they can't get their teeth through the chicken wire.
Yep. There's
So-
a lot cheaper way of doing it. Put your posts in and then use the black plastic netting, the fine black plastic netting,
Yeah.
and wrap that around. The deer can't see it. They don't have very good vision. So they bump up against it. They feel something on their nose, which is very sensitive. They can't identify it. And that spooks them and that stops them. Very, very effective. And that actually is what I had to do on my fence because they were weaseling their way through the fence. I had page wire fencing up to 8 feet, which I then extended up, but they were getting in through the fencing. And I had to put the black plastic on it as well. And that has completely stopped them. Any other
Okay.
questions?
What about moose?
Haven't had any problems with moose. Um,
Now,
Just
I
drop
don't
a
have
picture.
moose in my neighborhood, so I don't know at all. And I doubt that you would because moose live in wet areas and apples don't. So
well, Lori lives in Newfoundland and
ah,
probably
Okay.
moose everywhere.
I just
There are
dropped a
moose
picture
everywhere.
in the chat of last year. I was picking apples and we almost got charged by a moose. He came and just ate all the apples around on the ground.
okay. I doubt very much that a moose would be deterred by the black plastic.
Yeah.
And you need a hell of a sturdy fence to deter a moose, I would suspect.
Mm.
I don't have an answer. I'm sorry.
It's a nice picture I just put in the chat.
Lori, did you send that picture to everyone in the chat?
You're muted, Maury.
You might have just sent it to me, Lori. I got it.
I did. I accidentally sent it to David. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, send it to everyone if you can.
Yeah, I will. Okay.
Meanwhile, David, one thing is you wanted to have people be able to order things from you.
Yeah.
How do they do that specifically?
By
By
far the easiest way is simply to send me an email And I put an email address on the slides in multiple places. It is, the one that I'm using is spindoctor@eastlink.ca.
Okay, that's great. We've only got a couple of minutes. I do want to mention some of the upcoming events with Transition Bay, but before I do that, I got to tell the old apple joke. I don't know if you've heard this one, David. What's worse than biting into an apple and finding a worm?
Finding half a worm.
You got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Upcoming events, April 14th, our own celebrity chef, David Wimberly, has teamed up with heroic herbalist Deborah, and we're going to talk dandelion cuisine and dandelion medicine. So this is your opportunity. There's even been talk about a dandelion cookbook, so could be quite an evening there. And then also one day later on April 15th is the deadline for ordering trees if you live in the Bay Area. And we're going to be getting those from Baldwin Seeds out in the Valley. So those are two upcoming events. We've also got posted on our website at the crossroads here in St. Margaret's Bay. We're putting up the seed library free for everyone on April 10th, that's Sunday, and we're going to be prepping the raised beds. We're actually changing out the lumber on the raised beds. I just had it delivered here, some beautiful rough cut hemlock that's going to go in those raised beds. And then our annual spring planting, which is going to be our 11th year for the Crossroads Vegetable Garden. That's when we're going to plant the crop for the year. It's all volunteer run. And all of the produce goes to the St. Margaret's Bay Food Bank, about 500 pounds of vegetables every year. All of that's on our website, so check it out. And I think we got your picture here, Lori, and a song on picking apples with Mom last fall when the moose came by. That's fantastic. Okay.
It's called Apple Tree, so I thought you might be interested.
We're good. Fantastic.
So we'll save this program and it's going to be posted soon. So invite your friends to come and see this and then look at all the links and pages we have and join in later. We really hope you'll do that. Spread the word.
And if you don't know how, it is possible to save the chat box and everything that's in it. So you can go to the chat box. There's 3 little dots on the right-hand side down at the bottom. You click on that, and the first thing you do is it says Save Chat. So that gives you all of those links that are in there and that picture and the song from Lori and all of the other stuff that's in there. So go ahead and save your chat, and you'll have that for future reference. So David, this has been absolutely fantastic walkthrough.
Can I make one sort of personal comment? Laurie, if you are interested in other people on the island in Newfoundland who are growing apples and interested in, send me an email and I'll send you the names of people who are aficionados, because there's not very many of you in Newfoundland.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, I will. Yep.
Good.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
That's
And-
great.
Appreciate that very much. Thank you.
And the things that people will order from David, he'll bring them up here to St. Margaret's Bay, probably to my house in head of St. Margaret's, and then you can come by and pick them up really easily. We'll get that together when it seems like the right time, when people have reacted to this. Thanks.
Yeah. So if people decide they're going to do their own grafting, then we need to sort of get that order into the folk up in the valley to get the root stocks, because they have them. They can supply them. I can supply Signwood.
And for the stuff people are buying from you, David, can you accept an e-transfer?
Oh, I can, yeah,
Sure, great, easy done.
yeah. Anything, doesn't matter.
Would you deliver to Newfoundland?
No,
No.
sorry.
Come visit us again, Lori. Lori traveled down from Newfoundland a few years ago, almost a decade ago now, I think, to a weekend program on permaculture. And I see she's still doing it. Yay.
Where are you in Newfoundland?
I'm in St. John's, right on the East Coast.
Okay.
And that's definitely a moose eating all those apples off the ground.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, cow moose. That's the more dangerous than bulls.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone.
And thank you, David Maxwell. Yay.
And there, we will be putting a recording up on our website. So thank you. Oh, no, I think it goes on the Facebook page. Yeah.
Well, and the webpage. We're gonna
Okay.
do both. We're gonna do both.
All right. Very
There's
good.
There's a link on your webpage, I believe.
Yeah.
Yes, that'll be up there in just a few minutes. You can watch it there. But the better recording will be a YouTube that we will then post to YouTube and then link it
Yeah.
to our places. So great.
All right. Thanks, everyone, and good evening.
Thank you so much. Wonderful.